Welcome to this edition of ACN Conversations, a media resource of the Association of Christian Nonprofits. I'm Doug Leslie. Welcome back as we continue our conversation with Art Rayner, author of the book, The Minister's Salary and Other Challenges in Ministry Finance. Today, in part 2 of our conversation, we discuss with Art the value of a minister's tithe to his church and the real issues he faces as they struggle financially. Enjoy the conversation.
How much, and the question, this was later on in my questions, but I can ask it now because it feeds this same kind of idea. How much of the pastor, and I don't think people realize, I was on a pastoral staff too, so I get it, but I don't think a lot of people realize when a pastor walks through and they're teaching on items of stewardship, on financial management, on leading your family, and on the back end, they're facing these major stresses in their own life due to financial concerns. Can you kind of speak briefly in terms of what that does to a pastor psychologically in terms of, I don't want to say shame. Shame might be too hard of a word, but what they're feeling on the inside and what they're projecting on the outside aren't always the same thing.
Yeah. So let's say a pastor is preaching through Matthew 25 and is talking about the parable of the talents, and often I know it's not just talking about money there, but it is talking about money nonetheless, and that the pastor themselves they're struggling with their own financial well-being. There's credit card bills that have yet to be paid. There's utility bills that are and so they are struggling with their own financial position. And so you're right. It's not about shame, but they maybe question whether or not am I the right person to teach this because I'm struggling with it
right.
In my own life. Am I the one that really should be leading the church in this? Telling them to manage their finances well, telling them to steward their finances well, yet I'm not able to do it myself. And as you look throughout Scripture, we know that the Bible, that Jesus talks about money over and over and over and over again. And so for the pastor to be able to teach the Bible, to teach the Word in its entirety, he's going to talk about money. And so inevitably he's going to be faced with a text that deals with finances. So he's going to potentially could struggle teaching that text because he himself is struggling with those issues.
Yeah, that's good. All right, let's get to some specifics within the book. You state right out of the blocks that finance matters are different for ministers than it is for the rest of society. Why is that the case that people need to understand? Well,
so we have different rules applied to us as ministers that aren't applicable to really anybody else, and so we are in a weird situation where we have dual tax status. So we are in one sense employed for income tax purposes. In another sense, we are self-employed for Social Security purposes. And so ministerial finances are confusing, and there are some good resources out there, but I think there need to be more resources out there. Obviously, most of the resources when dealing with finances tend to hit on the mass audience, those rules that apply to the majority of Americans. And so pastors are somewhat on the fringe in how their finances operate, and so it's not nearly as discussed as the other elements of finance.
In the book, you tell several stories early on to kind of set the base, to give examples and real-world examples, and it strikes me early that at first, when I first read the book, my first reading, I thought, well, maybe some of these stories are allegorical. Maybe they're designed to just kind of put a face on some issues. But they're not allegorical, are they? I mean, these people are really in trouble in some instances in terms of getting their budget in place and trying to balance the expense items that they face every day in their life with what the amount of income they have.
I wish that they were not true stories, but they are. And there are many other stories that are out there. Some even very recent that I have just from, once again, conversations that I have with pastors about this topic. The stress that finances can cause is pretty common, I would say, among pastors. And so, I wish that I didn't have a story where a pastor came up to me, and this was in South Florida, met with me and wanted me to take a look at his retirement. He was approaching 70, and he said, "Here's what I have. What do I need to do?" And I looked at his retirement, and the only response that I could give him was, "Keep working. You're not in a position where you can retire. If you would retire, you would not be able to afford to live off of the retirement that you've made, and then anything else that was out there is just minimal income." And so I wish that wasn't a story. I wish I didn't have to have that conversation. I had another recent conversation with a pastor here in the state of North Carolina who just was not being paid very well from his church. Admittedly, I don't know the church budget, so I'm not trying to blame the church. But he was struggling financially. He had several kids. I believe it was over 4. So he was stressed, and they were to the point where they were using credit cards just to get by. And we're not talking about using a credit card and then paying it off the next month. The balances were building on those credit cards, and so he was becoming another statistic that. With credit card users in the United States, and he was asking, what do I need to do? And I wish that I had a great answer for them, but he really just needed to find some additional income if the church couldn't afford to pay him what he needed to be able to just get by. I mean, he was not trying to live extravagantly by any stretch of the imagination, but just get by and provide food for his family and provide a house, provide a roof over their head. I wish that wasn't a true story, but it is. And so they're out there, and they're unfortunately...
Are these stories the anomaly, or these the becoming more and more the regular stories of, especially in the small rural churches that we have around the country?
Yeah, in the small rural churches, I would say they're becoming more and more common. More pastors are faced with the question, do I go bivocational?
Yeah.
The church can no longer afford to have me on the payroll full time. So do I need to go bivocational? Or for those searching for a pastoral position, they're faced more often with the question, should I accept a bivocational role? Because that's what's out there right now.
Right.
And so it's becoming more and more common. There's no question about that. Now there's still some churches out there that can afford full-time pastors, number of full-time staff members. But I'm beginning to, I shouldn't say beginning to see a shift. There's been a shift going on for a while now, where churches are just not able to afford the staff that they used to be able to afford.
And so you're finding more and more are coming to you, and they're already in the hole because they've tried to use credit cards to kind of dig their way through, hoping life will get better, and then it just simply never gets better.
Right. It is with any credit card user. They don't swipe the card thinking, well, this is going to take me into debt for several years, and I'm going to pay double, triple what this TV cost over the life of this credit card debt. So they don't go into it thinking that will be the case. They always hope for the best. Unfortunately, it doesn't always turn out the way that they hope.
One of the issues that you bring up in the book, and actually I was really pleased to see that, is you strongly encourage pastors to make sure that they're faithful in tithing to their local church. Can you kind of speak into the importance of that reality?
Well, it's in my opinion, it's pretty unavoidable in Scripture, the issue of generosity and giving. The Bible teaches that giving is to be I'd say first a priority, that it is to be taken off the top, that giving is to be done proportionally. So, what I mean by proportionally is that those that have more are expected to give more, and those that have less are expected to give less. Right. That we're expected to be generous according to what we have been given by God. We're also expected to give sacrificially, and then we're expected to give joyfully. And you can see God actually leading the way in this. So, when we talk about priority, did God give his first and his best? Absolutely. Did he give proportionally? There's no question about it. He's a God that has everything, and so he gave what nobody else could give in his Son, Jesus Christ. Did he give sacrificially? Well, that's obvious. The answer is yes to that. And then as we get to the issue of joyful, we know the Bible tells us we need to be joyful givers. Well, is there a place where we can see God being joyful in the giving of his Son? And that's Isaiah 53:10, where we see him delighting in the sacrifice of his Son. And of course the question is, well, how can you be joyful and yet sacrificial at the same time? And I go back to Isaiah 53. It shows that God is essentially looking into the future. He's looking at it from an eternal perspective. And so that's how he's able to delight in it, because he knows that even in the midst of sacrifice, there are significant, incredible, awesome, eternal ramifications that are going to happen because of it. And so the idea of the pastor giving, it's in Scripture. There's not an exclusion clause for pastors, and not an exclusion clause for any of us. It's woven throughout Scripture. It's, in my opinion, pretty unavoidable. How
often do you find? I know one pastor, this is years ago, that told me that early on when I was getting into ministry, he mentioned when people come into my office and it's typical a marital issue where they're having problems in their marriage, one of the first questions he will ask them is, are you tithing? And so we know that biblical obedience in that tithing, and it was a great response from that guy, from the pastor who says those things. But the reality is when people first come to you are when they are having issues financially, how soon are you to ask those hard questions about, are you being faithful with which you've been given, even though you don't feel it's enough?
Well, I love that the pastor went right to the heart of potentially the heart of the issue. The reason why Christ talks about money so often is because it's such a reflection of our heart.
Right.
It's been said, you want to check out somebody's priorities, look at their checkbook. Now, of course, we don't use checkbooks very much anymore. So maybe log on to their online account and look at their expenditures there. But there's a lot of truth to that, and it's very telling what the priority in your life is, and if it's not reflecting a Christ-centric priority, then it's not going to be the only area, right? If there's going to be other areas in your life that are not centered on Christ,
right?
And so it's a good starting point. It's a great question to ask, because if the answer is no, I'm not giving, I'm not being generous with what God has given me, then more than likely there's several other areas in your life that where Jesus is not being put up as a priority.
And you mentioned very, very specifically when that's reflected into from the pastor back to the church, you mentioned in one story in the book where one of the ministers you were speaking with had been released from his job because of his lack of giving to the church that the board saw over a course of time, right?
That's right. And the pastor is not. There's obviously the biblical mandate to give,
right.
And so whether or not the board or the deacons or ever see the giving, there's a biblical mandate, and if they're avoiding it, there probably is a spiritual struggle there. But I wrote a blog post not too long ago that simply asked the question: should a pastor give to his church? And the response to it, just the question alone by those who were members in church, so lay people, was overwhelming. How could this even be a question?
Right.
Of course. How could I follow a pastor who's not giving to his own church? And so there's also a leadership issue there. So it's not only a spiritual issue, but there's a leadership issue that lay people are, just based on the response alone to that blog post, that lay people struggle or would struggle to follow a pastor, to listen to a pastor's words and take it to heart if they know that he is not giving to the church like they are.
Right.
You've been listening to the ACN Conversations, a ministry of the Association of Christian Nonprofits. To hear this full conversation or more clips, visit our website at www.christiannonprofits.org and click on resources. Until next time, I'm Doug Leslie.